guys, welcome back to my channel. I have a good one for you guys today. We are going to be testing out a couple of dupe palettes. I was fortunate enough to be sent the new Canyon and Blooms palette from Alter Ego. I'm very excited about these ones. In case you didn't know, these are meant to dupe the Natasha Denona Love and Bronze palettes. I'm a big fan of Natasha Denona eyeshadows, as you guys probably know. I'm also a big fan of Alter Ego. I have several of their other eyeshadow palettes. I talked a lot about them in the year 2020, and I cannot wait to see how these compare to the original Natasha Denona palette. So that is what we are doing today. We'll be doing two different eye looks using 4 palettes. We're going to start by comparing the Alter Ego Blooms palette on this side to the Natasha Denona Love palette on this side. And then for the second look, we'll be comparing the Alter Ego Canyons palette to the Natasha Denona Bronze palette on this side. I am super excited about this, you guys. I will say this is not the first time I've used these palettes. I've had them for a little over a week now. I've been using both of them regularly because I didn't want this to be a first impressions. I wanted to have a good feel for how these palettes have been performing for me. We'll kind of get into those details towards the end of the video. I'll let you guys know what I thought of these palettes' performance overall, but today we're just going to do kind of the side-by-side comparison. I'll give you guys details on pricing, we'll do side-by-side swatches, and then we will see how they perform. Should be a lot of fun. I hope that you guys are excited about it. If you are new here, welcome. I hope that you will consider subscribing if you haven't done that yet, but we do have a lot to do today, so let's jump into it. All right, so we are going to kick things off with the Blooms versus the Natasha Denona Love palette. So let's go over a couple of details first. First and most obviously is the price difference. This one right here is $16, whereas the original Natasha Denona Love palette is $65. Very big price difference. I do want to mention quantity. So this palette right here includes 15 grams of product. The Natasha Denona Love includes 19.25 grams of product. So you do get a little bit more product in here. Let's open them up and show you guys how they look side by side. So as you can see, some of the orders mixed up a little bit, but looks pretty promising. There are a couple shades that look a little bit different at first glance, but as I was swatching, we'll get to the swatches in a sec, I was surprised at how close the swatches were when the palettes and the pans may have looked a little bit more off than they actually were swatched. So let's just highlight the Blooms palette really quickly. I've mentioned this before, but I'm a huge fan of the Alter Ego packaging. I think for affordable dupe brands, they do such a good job with their packaging. It's really well made. This one is beautiful. I love the designs on these two palettes. I think they're really beautiful. This close-up of the flower petals is so pretty. Nice and sturdy and really well made. Here is a look at the shadows inside. I've been pretty impressed with this as I've been using it. I was pretty impressed with these as I swatched it, and I was even more impressed when I swatched it side by side with the Natasha Denona Love palette. I'll insert those for you guys right here. We'll see if that holds as we get into doing the 2 different looks on each eye, but so far I'm pretty hopeful. I'm pretty impressed. So let's go ahead and get into the look that we'll be doing today. I'm going to zoom you guys in and we will get started. So let's start with the first look. We'll be doing the Alter Ego Blooms palette on this side, the Natasha Denona Love palette on this side. We are going to be using some brushes that they sent to me today. These I think are a new set that they came out with. I've been pretty impressed with these. I've been using them for the last week. They do come with some face brushes as well, and I really love the face brushes, especially this one right here. Really good bronzer brush. I've been very impressed with it. So we'll use these today. I do have a clean rag here that I'll be wiping the brushes off in between each side so we don't have any contamination. We want this to be very scientific. Let's start off with the Blooms palette. So I think I'm going to kick things off by going in with this shade right here. This is the shade Azalea, kind of a little bit more of a peachy pink. This is one of those shades that in the pan it looks quite different from the coordinating shade in the Love palette, but swatched, they swatch a lot more similar than they look in the pan. I'm going to take that on the Alter Ego number 5 brush. I'm just going to start placing this kind of above my crease as my transition shade. So I'm dipping in really lightly. I like that pretty good pigmentation. This is my 3rd dip. But again, I'm only very lightly dipping in and then tapping off the excess. So kind of slowly building these up. Okay, let's go to the other side. Let's take the shade Intense in the Natasha Denona Love palette. Again, I'm just lightly dipping in. And we're going to kind of build that up above my crease. Those are looking pretty similar. I feel like they're going on pigmentation-wise pretty similarly as well. Both of them seem to blend really nicely. All right, now we're going to go in with this brush right here. This is the number 9 brush. We're going to go back to the Blooms palette and take the same shade, the shade Azalea. We're going to run a little bit of this on the lower lash line. This is the moment in using the Love palette that I wish I had a brown, like a neutral brown or tan, kind of mid-tone brown. Because I'm not a big fan of putting pink on the lower lash line. I don't mind it up here, but I don't know. I'm not sure I think it looks very good on me. Trying to just run that in about halfway. And then I'm kind of blending that through or building it up here on this outer corner right here. Wiped that off. Now we're going to go back into the Love palette and take the shade Intense and do the same. Let's take a little bit of this shade right here, the shade Snapdragon. I'm going to take that on the Alter Ego number 7 brush. This one's kind of a fluffy blending brush that's just slightly pinched. Reminds me a little bit of like the MAC 217 or the Wayne Goss number 18, but it's not quite as pointed. It's a little bit more flat at the top. Really soft though. This is one of the brushes I've been using a lot this last week. So I'm kind of just building this up on this outer half of the lid right there. I don't want to go too far in. Now wiping that off, we're going to go back to the Love palette. I'm going to take this corner shade right here, the shade Soul, and do the same thing on this side. Oh wow, this one, either the formula is a little softer, so I picked up a little more on my brush, or it is a little bit more pigmented than this one on this side. I feel like I might need to go back and add a little bit more over here. So I am going to go back into the Blooms palette and take a little bit more of that shade Snapdragon. Just add a tiny bit more here to get these to look even. Now I'm going to go in with this brush right here. This is the number 11 brush. And now I'm going to go into this shade right here, the shade Black Dahlia, which is kind of a deep burgundy. And I'm just very lightly going to run this kind of in this outer V right here, just to build up a little bit of depth. And take a tiny bit more of that, just very lightly run it under this outermost corner right here. I'm not going in very far though, just kind of darkening up this corner of my eye. Okay, wiping that off, we're going to jump over to the Natasha Denona palette. And I'm going to take this shade here at the top. This is the shade Heartbeat, and do the same on this side. Super pretty. All right, now I want to add a little bit of a liner. We're going to take this shade right here. This is the shade Black Dahlia. This is one of the cream to powder formulas. This is a very interesting formula. It's a little bit tricky to work with. It definitely is something that needs either a stiff brush or a dense brush. A fluffy, loose brush is not going to work with this type of a formula. It's kind of meant to be packed on, almost kind of sponged on, and I find that to be true with the Natasha Denona version of this formula as well. So I'm going to take that shade on this little angled brush right here. This is their number 12 brush, and we're just going to start lining the upper lash line only, just kind of the outer half of the upper lash line. I'm going to draw a bit of a wing with this shade. So I wanted to point out that feature of this formula, because this is a formula that when I first tried out in the Natasha Denona palette and also in the Alter Ego palette, I feel like I was a little disappointed in it, because it doesn't have a lot of impact on first application or first swatch. It does not swatch very well. They're very, very sheer, but they do build up pretty nicely, and they have a really pretty creamy texture to them. So they're a unique formula. They're one that I think if you're not aware of what they are, you probably would think they're pretty weak. They're just very different. So we're going to go over to this side. I'm going to take the shade Commitment from the Natasha Denona palette, and we're going to do the same. Kind of just start. So this one I think might be a little bit more pigmented, a little bit less sheer. And I think I noticed that swatching these two shades as well. The Natasha Denona one was just a little bit more intense. I mean, not much. I think probably on the eyes, with just a tiny bit more effort, they'll look pretty much identical. I mean, I really can't tell a difference at all. Okay, now I want to go into this shade right here. We're going to take the shade Hibiscus, which is kind of a shimmery, rosy color, and I'm going to put that all over the outer half of my eyelid just with my finger. And then wiping off the finger, I'm going to take my finger along the edge just to kind of blend it out a little. There we go. Then into the Natasha Denona, we're going to take the shade Passion and do the same thing on the other side. I do think with these two shades, and there's actually another shade in here, so these two shimmery shades in the Natasha Denona palette. If you look closely at the swatches, I'm not sure it will pick up on camera, but they do both have a little bit more sparkle or subtle glitter in them in the Natasha Denona version. Okay, I'm gonna go back into that original blending brush and we're gonna just run this along this top edge very lightly. I'm gonna take a clean finger and kind of try and blend out this edge. I feel like that got a little sloppy right there. Now I want to take the shade, let's take the shade Lily, which is this one right here. It's kind of a pinky gold color. And we're gonna run that all over the inner half of the lid. I'm gonna wipe that finger off and I'm just gonna tap over the center to kind of blend this edge out and press those two shimmers kind of together. I'm really just pressing more than I am wiping. And then in the Natasha Denona palette, we're going to take the shade Transparent and do the same on this side. Wiping off that finger, I'm going to do the same, just kind of tap it in the center. I'm going to add just a little bit more to my transition area. We're going to take that first shade that I used, which was the shade Azalea, and on that angled brush, the number 10 brush, I'm just going to run this really lightly, kind of right up above, right up on my brow bone, right where that darker shade ends, just to kind of blend things out. And I'm wiping it off and going back over the top edge of it just to make sure it's nice and blended. Oh wow, that made it really intense. Okay, now back into the Natasha Denona, the shade Intense, adding a touch of that to this side. Alright, that I think looks great. Let's add some mascara, then I will zoom out and we will go over some details on these two palette comparisons. Alright guys, so here is the finished look of both palettes. We have Alter Ego on this side, Natasha Denona on this side. I feel like they look pretty similar. Honestly, even application, I didn't feel like I had to dip into the Blooms palette more than I had to dip into the Natasha Denona palette, which surprised me. Even after playing with these, I kind of assumed maybe they, when I did a comparison, would not be quite as pigmented as the original Natasha Denona palette, because I have to say, you guys, even across the board of all the palettes of hers that I have 4 of them now, well, 4 of these sized palettes. This one is, I think, the most intense. I mean, the pigment in some of these pinks and reds is really intense. Things get bold very quickly, but this one I thought was intense, just as pigmented, but I feel like it worked just as good. It was easy to blend. I didn't have any issues with the shadows. I feel like even on the eyes, the shimmers look pretty much identical. So I am quite impressed with these two palettes so far. As far as how they wear compared to each other, I'm not going to be able to do that comparison today because I'm going to be washing this off and doing the next palettes that we'll be comparing. So I will try to keep using them and keep you guys updated if I notice any differences in wear time. I will say though, as I've used this palette a couple of times now, the other times that I used it, I didn't notice any issues with the shadows wearing off by the end of the day. It's pretty rare. It takes a pretty terrible eyeshadow formula to completely fade or wear off my eyes throughout the day, especially if I use an eyeshadow primer, which I did use, by the way. I forgot to mention I use the Lorac eyeshadow primer. So I don't anticipate that will be a problem, but if I notice that in the coming weeks, I will keep you guys posted. So here is a quick close-up of these two side by side so you can see how they look in a little bit more detail. But now I'm going to go ahead and wash this look off. Then we are going to get into the Bronze and Canyon palette comparison. Alright guys, moving on to the Canyon palette. So here is a look at the inside. Let me just show you guys how these look side by side. Once again, as you can see, the colors are a little bit mixed up, but very similar looking palettes right here. Same thing with price on this one. This one is $16, whereas the Bronze palette is $65. Also the same thing with the amount of product. This one does have a little bit less product in it. Here's a closer look at the packaging of the Canyon palette. Oh, this one has my heart. This one is beautiful. I'm from Utah, so this kind of southern Utah, red cliffs and canyons really hits home for me. Nice and sturdy, beautiful packaging. And here's a look at the shades inside by themselves. And then here you can see the shades swatched side by side with their shade duplicates in the Natasha Denona Bronze palette. Once again, this one surprised me. I think with the exception of one shade, I would say the shade Cliff compared to the shade Alloy in the Natasha Denona palette. Other than those two swatches, which are only slightly different, I think everything else swatched very, very similar. So the two shades I was talking about is this one in the center right here, the shade Cliff, and that one is supposed to be a dupe for this one in the center, the shade Alloy. As you can see, this one is not quite as gold or as yellow toned as this one. I think swatched, that difference is not as dramatic as you would think it would be, but there is a little bit of a difference in those two shades. Let's jump into the eye look. I'm going to zoom you guys in and we will get started. So I'm going to start off with this shade right here, the shade Rattlesnake. I love this transition shade, and I'm just taking that on the Alter Ego number 5 blending brush. I've got a little bit of concealer I didn't blend out on my eyelids. There we go. Brushes are pretty soft. Okay, I'm going to wipe that off, and then we're going to go into the Natasha Denona palette and take the shade Beach down here in the corner. I think the shade Beach in the Natasha palette feels, just with the brush on dipping in, a little bit softer, and I can tell this one is a little bit more pigmented. As far as the shade, I think they're very similar, so I'm going to go actually back into that first palette, the shade Rattlesnake. I'm going to add just a little bit more. I feel like I got more pigment on this side. Yeah, I can definitely tell. For this specific one, the color is the same, but the formula is a little bit less pigmented. I think you need maybe to build it up just a little bit more. All right, now we're gonna run, let's go in with this shade, the kind of mustardy shade. Let's run that one under the lower lash line. I'm gonna take this kind of smudge brush, the number 9 brush, and run that underneath here. I kind of want to do like a really smudgy lower lash line. So this is gonna be a little bit, it's going to look a little messy. We're going to go a little wide with this one because we're going to kind of deepen it up with other shades. Now with this palette, the shade Ridge is the dupe shade. And again, just running that pretty far under that lower lash line. Why don't we take this shade right here? I'm going to go into the shade Russet, this kind of reddy deep brown right here. And we're going to take that on the, let's take it on the number 10 brush, which is kind of that, it's like a fluffy angled brush. I kind of like these type of brushes. I don't use them very often, but they can be kind of useful. And I kind of build up depth on the upper and lower lash line. So I'm kind of blending it into this outer third of the lid, and then I'm going to start building it along the lash line and also the lower lash line. Just the outer corner of the lower lash line. Okay, now into the other palette, we're going to take the shade Magma right here in the corner, and same thing. I'm kind of starting at the lash line, blending it in this outer corner, and then we'll build it up a little more on the lash line. I think this is another shade. This one is really soft, so if you're not careful with your brush, you need to use a little bit less pressure in the Natasha Denona palette with some of the mattes because they're just a little bit softer, a little bit more pigmented if you get too much on your brush, so they can be a little bit more intense on that first dip and might require a little bit more blending out. Okay, I'm going to add a little bit more to my brush. I'm going to run that under the lower lash line. And actually add a little bit more on this side, back into the other palette, the shade Russet, just so it's just as deep and rich as the other side. Okay, I think those look pretty even. Now let's add a, let's see, so many bronze shimmers to choose from. Which shade of bronze do we want to go with? So I'm leaning towards, so here's the shade Cougar, that's the one I've used the most this week. And here is the shade Rust, that looks really pretty. Then this is the shade Coyote. Let's go with this one. Let's go with Rust. It's a little bit more cool toned. That's this shade of bronze. I mean, I still would call it, I wouldn't call it a cool tone by any means, but it's the most cool toned, least kind of orangey or gold of the bronzes in here. So I'm going to take this shade and just start tapping it all over the center of the lid. Oh, that's pretty. I'm leaving just that very innermost corner open right there. That is beautiful. Oh, I love that. All right, and now we're going to go into the Natasha Denona and take the shade right here, the shade Palladium. But they look pretty similar, huh? I don't know, they look pretty similar. I would actually say this one might be a little bit more intense. I think maybe even this one, if you use a little bit too much, it emphasizes texture a little bit more. It has that kind of chunky sort of effect, whereas this one is more of a creamy, kind of smooth shimmer. I think if I went in with a little bit more of a light hand on this side, they probably would look identical to each other. All right, that looks really pretty. Let's add Here's the tricky thing with this palette. I find myself wanting something lighter for my inner corner, but there's not something in here that's quite as light as I would like it to be, but that's okay. We're gonna go ahead and just kind of make it work. So I'm gonna use, let's go with the shade Cougar. The one that I mentioned is I've been using the most this last week. I'm gonna take that on kind of a fluffy, small brush. This is the number 11. And I'm gonna run that just on the inner part of the lid. Overlap the other bronze. And then into this side, we're going to take the shade Silk. I do want to try and use the cream to powder color, kind of like I did in the other look. I want to try and use this as a bit of a liner again. So we're going to do kind of what we did before. I'm going to take that shade Expanse here in the corner, and we're going to run that. I'm going to connect this outer corner down to the lower lash line this time, actually. Just like a little wing right there that starts from the lower lash line. Okay, now I'm going to go wipe it off and go into the bronze palette. We're going to take this shade right here, which is the shade Deep Dive, and do the same thing on the other side. Oh, this brush is a little sharp. And I'm going to go back to that really small, sort of fluffy brush, and we're going to just, nothing on it, just kind of run it just to blend all that together on the outer corner. I'm really kind of running that right where those lower lashes are, just to blend all those dark browns together. I think I'm going to do some brown liner on my upper and lower waterline, and then I'm going to add some mascara. Then I will meet you guys back here and we'll talk about how these two compared. Alright guys, so here's the finished look using the Canyon palette and the bronze palette. I'm pretty impressed. This one looks pretty good as well. So far, I think things are looking pretty good. As I mentioned, there's a couple of differences, and I wouldn't necessarily say the performance, but I really just think some of the Natasha Denona mattes, they're a little bit more loosely pressed, so if you're not super light-handed with your brush, you can get some serious pigment and intensity very quickly. Whereas some of the mattes in the Alter Ego palettes, I think can be a little bit more firmly pressed, so maybe you don't get as much product picked up on your brush, so they might take a little bit more building. But I'd say it's a pretty minor difference, and it doesn't take long to get the same level of depth from the Alter Ego matte. So I'm pretty impressed so far. I'm going to insert for you guys a close-up of this look right here so you can see a little bit more closely, see if you notice any differences. I've looked pretty close and I don't really see anything visibly different between the two looks. I even think the shimmers look identical on the lid. And that to me is pretty impressive. I mean, we're talking a $16 versus a $65 palette. So as much as I love you, Natasha Denona, and I always will, I'll always still love my Natasha Denona palettes, that's pretty awesome to have such a great affordable option for those of you that can't splurge for the $65 palette. And moreover, this gets me really excited that they might in the future dupe the Glam palette, because that, of all the Natasha Denona palettes that I have and have tried, I think that one's my very favorite. So I can't wait to see what they do with that one. I will try and keep you guys posted on how these shadows were, if I noticed anything unusual with them as far as lasting power or any issues with them. As I mentioned, I have been wearing these for the last week on and off, so I have been playing with them for a while, and I haven't noticed anything so far, so I don't anticipate that will be the case. But overall, I'd say this is a major win. I really love the Alter Ego formula. It works really well for me. I was a little bit nervous. I did see a couple people do some comparisons, and I didn't want to watch those videos because I didn't want to be influenced by other people's opinions before I tried these out for myself. But it appeared from some thumbnails that this might not be as good as I was hoping that it would be. So I'm happy to report that for me, these worked out really well. And I definitely would recommend them for those of you that maybe couldn't splurge for the more expensive Natasha Denona palette. I think these are a great option. But that is all I have for today's video. I hope that you guys enjoyed this one. I'd love to hear your thoughts if you have tried out these palettes for yourselves. Let me know what you guys thought. I'm a big fan, but I know we're all different, and I think that information would be helpful to everyone. So leave that down in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for joining me today. I hope that you are all doing well. I want to give you one more reminder. If you are not yet subscribed, I hope you'll consider doing that before you leave. But that is it for today. Thank you guys again. I will see you in my next video. Bye. So I'm kind of feeling like doing something very bronzy. That's your only option with this palette. It's beautiful, but there's a lot of bronze in here. Not really many other directions that you can go.